Hi, and welcome to another Intercultural Book Commentary by me, Gerardo. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Violence by Slavoj Zizek. So, why am I going to choose this book to talk about? Basically because I am very interested in the phenomenon of violence, having grown up in Mexico, a very violent country, and having lived in Europe for the last 13 years. So having spent half of my life in a very violent place and half of my life in what is pretty much the safest place or the safest continent on Earth, I cannot but wonder at the difference and the meaning of such phenomenon and why it takes place and what does that mean, and also trying to understand the uneasiness of the peace in Europe. So that's why I chose this book. Also, Zizek is a very fun writer. It's always a pleasure to read one of his books, although they are a little bit difficult because he is not very methodic and he is not, he's a continental philosopher, so he is not going to be very methodical and structured, and not too empirical either. But there are still some really interesting, valuable reflections in his book that I want to develop a little bit. So, for starters, one of the most important contributions that he makes in this book is the distinction between what he calls subjective and objective or systemic violence. So, by subjective violence, he means violence where the perpetrator is very clearly identifiable. So if somebody punches somebody else, if somebody kills somebody else, then it's really clear it's a subjective violence event. Whereas objective violence is more systemic. So how can you exemplify this? For instance, if people use too many resources, so they eat too much or they take too much land, and there are people who do not get enough and as a result of that die. This, according to Zizek, would be objective violence. Or basically, subjective violence in some cases can be symptomatic of objective violent conditions. And then something that he talks about a lot, and it's also very interesting, is the seeming obsession that exists in the Western world with subjective violence. So every time a violent act occurs, a subjective violent act, there's outrage, condemnation, and people try to do everything to stop it from happening again. But Zizek actually says this is hypocritical because it's not looking at the causes of this violence. So, for instance, every time there's a shooting in a school in the U.S., then people go crazy and start introducing metal detectors in schools and whatnot, instead of trying to look at the real causes of violence. So perhaps gun legislation or culture. So he considers this hypocritical, also because if we are talking about the systemic injustice of the capitalist system, then obviously people who benefit from it will not talk about that, but would rather talk about how criminal immigrants come down from the outskirts of Paris and London in a barbaric attack and basically ignore the circumstances that enable this violence. So an example that kind of follows this line of thought is when he talks about the term liberal communists. So the sort of hipsters of Davos, people who have gone from the Porto Alegre summit to Davos in Switzerland, and the sort of smart geek CEOs that have taken over multinational companies, so Bill Gates, Zuckerberg and such, and people who are apparently not ideological, but just want to solve problems. They just want to get things done. So Zizek considers them actually to be problematic and actually an obstacle in the way of real progressive change. So to illustrate that, I'll quote from the book. He says, "Precisely because they want to resolve all the secondary malfunctions of the global system, liberal communists are the direct embodiment of what is wrong with the system as such." And yeah, there is a point to this, because you know, if one is like fighting symptoms and not looking at the disease, then basically people will keep getting sick and not get cured. Then there's also some more interesting comments on universalism and particularism, interculturalism, and like atheism and religious convictions for peaceful coexistence. So concerning suicide or terrorist attacks, he says that actually there's this big misunderstanding, and these people are characterized as fundamentalists and arrogant people who think that their religion is better, and that they are actually fundamentalists in the sense that they are totally convinced of their religion, whereas Zizek actually puts this in question. He doesn't believe that, because he says that somebody who really believes his religion is the chosen one and the superior one then can be very indifferent about everyone else, because on the inside he knows that he's right. So actually, when somebody commits a terrorist attack out of religious motivations, what is going on is the result of doubt and insecurity, and even perhaps an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West in the cases that Zizek talks about. So in that sense, to quote Zizek again, he says that the primary vice of a bad person is that he is more preoccupied with others than with himself, in this case. Then something that is really, really important, and that I was really happy to read about, because it's something that I have been thinking about as well, is the nature of racism and media coverage of certain issues related to criminality, for instance. So he uses the example of New Orleans in 2005, when all sorts of stories came up about looting and raping and stealing after Hurricane Katrina, and how these news issues were manipulated or presented to create an image of the mainly African American population of New Orleans. So basically, what he's saying is, he's talking about this conflict between mentioning the ethnic origin of people who commit crimes or keeping quiet about it. And actually, what I like about him is that he looks at it in a completely different way, and he says it's not about whether you say the rapist or the thief was from XYZ country or keep quiet about it. It's about why you mention it. What really is that you are seeking. And to really illustrate this example, then I use one that is not from the book, but I think shows it perfectly. In the Netherlands, you have this xenophobic Party of Freedom, and they introduced a debate in Parliament about what they call, in a very bad way, the Moroccan problem. So they come to Parliament and they say that there is a Moroccan problem, because Moroccans are overrepresented in all sorts of statistics of theft and violent crime and poor economic performance, unemployment, etc. And therefore, according to them, there is a Moroccan problem that needs to be solved. But obviously these people are very nasty, and you see that they are not concerned about Moroccans. They actually see them, they really see them as a problem in the most negative sense of the word. Not a problem as something that concerns everyone out of empathy, but something that's in the way or troubling an otherwise peaceful, happy society, according to them. So the interesting thing was that as a response to that, a member of the Socialist Party with Turkish origins took over the word and said, well, listen, you're talking about the Moroccan problem, but there's another problem that you're ignoring. And she was saying this as a joke, or not seriously as a jest, but she said, you're ignoring the male problem, because if you look at statistics, males are much more overrepresented in all the crimes and all the statistics that you have just mentioned. And I don't see you talking about it, so if you're talking about the Moroccan problem, then I think you should be addressing the male problem as well. And this, of course, was very powerful, and they couldn't say anything about it because it's just so true. But she didn't mean it, however. But actually, here is when Zizek's reflections come in. Neither solution is good. Keeping quiet or mentioning it, they are both bad. What you need to do is mention problems when they arise, or talk about problems when they arise, but not because you're a racist, just because you see that there's a problem and that it needs to be solved. So if a population is overrepresented, then it is good to look into why and what can be done, but not to stigmatize people, but to solve the problem. So I think that's really good. And if you are a racist, and if deep in your heart you don't like whatever type of minority, and you make a news article, even if factually they have done something, the prejudice of the writer taints the piece, and this is quite clear to anybody who wants to see. So I was happy to read that in Zizek's book. And there's much more that could be said. For instance, on certain overreactions to issues such as the Mohammed cartoons in Denmark. How that would not really be a reaction to the cartoons themselves, but to a whole series of other problems faced by the Muslim community, invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, problems in Israel, but how sometimes these things come up and they act as triggers of all sorts of other underlying problems that people have much more difficulty addressing because they're just so hard to solve. And so, for instance, how in the Muslim world there's a tendency to sometimes blame everything on Israel, even when the things are not related, and then this stops people from solving problems and moving forward. Then one criticism that I have to make is on his comments on atheism. He says that basically religions are very problematic. So quoting David Hume in the book, he says, the only way to show a true respect for God is to act morally while ignoring God's existence. So it's talking about how morality shouldn't happen because, for instance, of the promise to go to heaven or the threat to go to hell. I mean, if it is moral, then you shouldn't need either an incentive or a threat to do the right thing. So far so good. But then he goes on to say that basically whenever different religions come together, then there's tensions and it's not possible to have a sort of ecumenic peaceful coexistence, and therefore atheism would be a solution. I don't know how he interprets atheism though, because I think what would be really correct would be to use agnosticism, then that would be fine, because atheism is also a little bit of a religion in the sense that there is this certainty of the non-existence of God, whereas religions are certainty of the existence of God, but basically the problem is not the belief or lack of belief, but this certainty. Whereas an agnostic, actually I think really agnosticism could be a key in helping to create a more peaceful coexistence between people. Which in this case could mean believing in something but admitting that there is a chance that you might be wrong, and being okay with this with this chance of being wrong. If we can learn to deal with that, I think then a lot of progress will be made in improving relations between people and cultures. Then there's some interesting comments that I will not get into detail about this time, but that I will probably come back to later on how René Descartes sees ethnicity and particularism as not being a category of truth. So truth per se, according to Zizek and Descartes, has to be universal. Then in another video I will get back into this and also talk about the fight that Zizek has had with Walter Mignolo, and how this tendency to propose universalism comes into conflict with the post-colonial. I think that's a really interesting debate that needs to be analyzed in more detail because it's quite juicy. So I'll get into that in another video. And then yes, then also he does make some comments about Peter Sloterdijk and Alain Finkielkraut, philosophers who argue more for particularism and are more of a conservative trend, and he suggests that they might be doing this out of a certain jealousy or envy at the possibility of real universalism joining people together. Then he also talks about Walter Benjamin, who has some really interesting comments about the politicization of culture and the culturization of politics. Really good stuff to sort of counter this whole idea of the clash of civilizations. And there's an excellent quote in the book, actually. He says that every clash of civilizations in the end really is a clash of barbarisms. That I thought was very good. And then he talks about this sort of divine violence that he develops from Walter Benjamin, but that didn't interest me so much. The interesting thing at the end was a quote on non-violence. So he says, or not doing anything as a form of violence. He says, and that's the last paragraph of the book, if one means by violence a radical upheaval of the basic social relations, then crazy, tasteless as it may sound, the problem with historical monsters who slaughter millions was that they were not violent enough. Sometimes, doing nothing is the most violent thing to do. And here he was talking about participating in elections which are considered to be pointless. So I don't know if this is my point of view, but if we see the rates of abstention in the recent European Parliament elections, and they can go as high as 88% in Slovakia, I think it was, then one sees that not doing anything can be a sort of form of violent protest. So to wrap it up, I'm actually going to use the example of one of the online reviews I found, which is a joke, and Zizek likes jokes a lot. So the joke that this reviewer used was basically two friends, slightly drunk, go to see a play. In the middle of the play, one of them says, "Oh, I really need to go to the toilet, I'll be right back." He goes out, walks into the hallway, can't find the toilet, so then he goes through a back door and pees on a pot. Then he comes back, and then his friend tells him, "Oh, you just missed the most interesting part. Some dude came out and pissed in the plant pot." So I think this really kind of wraps it up in a very good way, what Zizek is trying to say. And what he's trying to say is basically that we believe that with all the complexity of the things going on, we don't know whether we are part of things or whether we are participating, but actually when we think that we are withdrawing, we are actually at the center stage of many events. So really quite an interesting book. If you have time for it, I really recommend it, and I will be reviewing other more interesting books as well in the future. If you have any recommendations or if you have any comments, please let me know. Or any questions, I would love to get into a discussion with you. So thank you for watching, please share, and I'll see you next time for another intercultural book commentary.